pioneers in economic reforms in Asia, and we are also pioneers in setting new budget in new trend in budget formulation in this country. I would like to the afternoon first session is going to be first. Deshal is going to talk about budget 2017. I don't know to preempt, but I simply can't resist his title. His title, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's like a Western movie. So I'm sorry, I preempted you, So Deshal will take us through next half an hour, his take on the budget, and then we have a panel discussion with some great speakers, people who have great insight to the economy and the industry. Over to you, Deshal. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Deshal Demal. And I'll show you last 5 minutes. Okay.
No problems. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much to LBO, LBR for the opportunity once again to have a chat about some of the recent policy developments and the implications of that on outlook for the next year and outlooks on overall economic policy and the way forward for the directions of the Sri Lankan economy. So yeah, I'm going to speak about primarily about the budget 2017 and the implications thereof, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as was preempted. And I think it's important to always have a bit of a historical context as well. For me, I think when we stood here this time last year, it was a fairly different situation. We had already had a budget in the early part of 2015. We had the term budget that came in February. Wages, a number of price reductions on essential items, and basically it was a very populist budget that came in February 2015. Subsequent to that, in November 2015, for the more regular budget, there again we had a number of further increases on the fiscal expansion side and rather unrealistic revenue targets that we discussed on this stage during that time. And at that time, the markets also reacted quite badly to that kind of expansionary fiscal situation that we saw in the previous budget. And that situation was really accentuated by the fact that global markets were also in a fairly volatile and uncertain period. In December last year, we had the rate hike by the U.S. Federal Reserve. So anyway, global markets were quite jittery and capital out of emerging and frontier markets. And in that context, with Sri Lanka's perceived weakening on the fiscal side, things became fairly negative in terms of confidence. We saw global markets basically losing confidence in Sri Lanka's fiscal consolidation path around this time last year into early 2016. Things kind of came to a head in around March 2016. We saw the secondary market yields on Sri Lankan US dollar denominated bonds going up above 8% in the 5 years and beyond tenors, and that was a really unsustainable level. It was a level at which we probably couldn't have been able to refinance and roll over our debt at any kind of affordable level. So it was in that context that we've had to go to the IMF. The agreement came through in June 2016, and that was really seen as an anchor that brought in returning some degree of confidence to Sri Lanka's fiscal situation. And that momentum has carried on in the last few 4-5 months as well. We've seen an improvement in government revenue collection also in the first 9 months of 2016. That, and along with the fact that there was a change in leadership in the central bank. The government was able to tap into global markets in late July 2016. So all of those general positive movements were manifestations of improved confidence in the Sri Lankan economy, in Sri Lanka's macro fundamentals, particularly by the global market. And it is in that context that we arrived at the budget for the 2017 budget that was going to be presented in November. And there was a lot of concern and a lot of expectation in the market as to how this budget would stand compared to last year. Would it again step into that fiscal expansionary path, or would we see a more consolidation approach, a more conservative approach? And really, what was the order of the day was really a sort of austerity budget. And it is actually that the outcome actually has been relatively positive in that context. The budget that was presented has not been one that has looked at being too expansionary. It is initially a lot more realistic, and that is the kind of context that I want to really present this afternoon. So, as I was saying, the most urgent priority for the budget 2017 was to really reinforce this macroeconomic, the fiscal consolidation path. I think that was the absolute priority from a global market perspective, and basically the requirement for Sri Lanka to be able to service its debt and to be able to balance its macroeconomic path. And as I said, the 2017 budget has actually been a lot more realistic in terms of its revenue targets and its expenditure expectations. If you look again at last year, the revenue growth expectation for 2016 was about something like 38% growth. And that didn't really have the teeth, didn't really have the kind of revenue measures to justify that kind of huge increase in growth. We have seen fairly positive growth, around 20% in the first 9 months, though the projections that have been given in the budget for the full year are a little bit less than that. Nonetheless, there has been some improvement in 2016, and that appears to be largely driven by some degree of administrative improvement as well. But what is heartening is that there has been a broader improvement on the fiscal side in the first part of this year also. Even on the expenditure front, it's a relatively conservative budget for 2017 also, and both of these measures are actually quite good. So what we are seeing is a general improvement in direction. So in 2015, we had the budget deficit really ballooning out of control to 7.4% of GDP. The projected deficit for this year, for 2016, is 5.4%. It might end up being slightly higher than that, but still relative in a fairly comfortable position and a lot better than it was in 2015. And the estimate for 2017 is 4.6% of GDP. And that would be an excellent number if we are able to meet that target. And I don't think we'd actually be too far off, just judging by the numbers that we have and the kind of assumptions that the government has been working with. So, touching initially on revenue trends. So, what I want to do is just to look at some of the headline areas and compare it with what I would think are the policy priorities for Sri Lanka's economy and the other stated longer-term economic objectives. Now, one positive change is that there is a lot more focus on trying to enhance income taxes. And that is really what I would see that as a desirable shift towards a greater balance between direct taxes and indirect taxes. Direct taxes obviously are a lot more equitable in terms of its impact on social justice as well. And at present, we have about a 20% collection from direct taxes and 80% from indirect taxes. And that is, of course, I would say that is an imbalance that is not an equitable situation from a national interest perspective. So the government's stated objective is to move towards a 40-60, with 40% collection from direct taxes and 60% from indirect taxes. And I think that is it's a good direction to work towards. And this budget, we have seen certain steps taking us in that path. Still, you're going to see a big contribution coming from indirect taxes compared to direct. It will be about 25-75 if the numbers work out the way that is being expected. But still, the direction of change, as I said, is quite good. You're seeing a lot more emphasis on. We've seen an increase in the rates of personal and some corporate income taxes as well in some cases. And also, I think importantly, there's been a number of tax incentives that have been rationalized. Now, this could have some detrimental impacts in the short term for certain sectors. So, for instance, in some of the financial instruments, there has been a removal of some of the tax incentives that have been given. It was these tax incentives that drove the growth in these instruments. So, for example, things like corporate debentures in the secondary market and so on. Some of these incentives are now being removed. Also, if you look at some of the areas where corporate income tax has gone up from the concessionary rate of 10 or 12%, up to 28%, sectors such as tourism are going to be affected by that. So these may have some kind of detrimental impacts in the short term on some of these sectors and some of these areas. But the way that I would look at it is that taxes really shouldn't be seen as primarily be seen as a tool of kind of trying to create incentives for growth of sectors and so on. Taxes should primarily be seen as a revenue instrument. That is their primary objective. There should be other measures of ways of trying to encourage certain sectors or to stimulate the development of certain business areas or certain areas of national interest. Taxes should really be seen as a revenue generation tool and really nothing else. I think one of the problems, one of the reasons that we have seen such an erosion of Sri Lanka's tax buoyancy, the fact that our tax to GDP ratio has come down so rapidly in the last decade or so, is the result of the proliferation of all these tax incentives and tax exemptions. So as a broad policy, the thrust towards rationalization of tax incentives, I think, is good. Of course, you're going to have short-term implications on some of these sectors, but I think we should focus more on trying to encourage these sectors through alternative measures instead. So looking at the realism of some of the revenue targets that we are seeing, if you look at, for instance, corporate income tax, personal income tax, there are significant expectations of growth, around 40% in some cases. Now, here, for instance, there is a lot of the onus on the growth on tax revenue is coming from improvements on the administrative side. And that is something that it leaves a little bit of room for uncertainty, the extent to which that could actually materialize. There is reason to believe that it is possible, given the implementation of measures such as the RAMIS system, which is expected to improve the information systems available to the tax department and thereby better enable collection of revenue than what we have been seeing in the recent past. So along with the administrative improvements, of course, we have seen significant rate increases on the income tax side, so that should also provide some kind of support to this. The government's primary the assumption in its revenue calculations is also a base increase supported by real GDP growth of 6.3% and inflation of 4%. Now, I think this is there's a slight overestimation on the real GDP growth. I think 6.3% would be fantastic, but I don't know if that is something that we could actually achieve. And I also think the inflation figure is probably understated. So what is relevant in terms of the implications for tax collection and revenue is nominal GDP. So even if you have, say, real GDP growth of 5% and inflation of 5 or 6%, then you're coming to a fairly similar level to what the government is estimating at 6.3 and 4. So I don't think that is too much of a problem. Your revenue base should be still growing at the level that the government has in its assumptions as well. So by and large, I think the corporate and the personal income taxes, the government should be able to come towards its target as long as it's able to achieve the administrative improvements that have been envisaged. So that will be the key. It's also heartening to note that in the budget speech itself, there's a lot of emphasis on some of these administrative improvements. So clearly there has been some kind of focus and understanding of the importance of this to achieve the targets that have been determined. Where I feel that there could be some overestimates is really on the import taxes side. The government is again assuming about a 7% growth of imports into 2017, and I think this again might not materialize. Largely because I'm expecting next year demand to be quite subdued on aggregate level. So when aggregate demand is quite low, you're generally going to see less demand for imports as well. Also, the global economic situation is such that I don't think you're going to see significant rises in commodity prices as well. So by and large, the scope for import expenditure to increase by 7% or above, I would say, is quite limited. At the same time, as always, a significant proportion of the imported revenue expectations is coming from excise duties, and excise duties on motor vehicles in particular. Here again, I don't see the demand for motor vehicle imports is likely to be subdued, because interest rates are going to probably remain quite high into 2017 as well. And also with the changes in the loan-to-value ratios for motor vehicles, the demand side on that side is probably going to be quite muted. So I don't see a lot of realism in the import tax generation side. Also, for instance, there's again an expectation of import of earnings from cess to be increasing, but at the same time, the speech mentions a reduction of cess on about 100 items. So some of those things don't exactly tally up. But I don't think overall, even with the potential overestimation on import-based tax collection, I don't think you're going to be too far off, because particularly with the increase in VAT from 11% to 15% and some of the other changes on VAT and NBT, I'd expect there to be a significant collection on the indirect taxes on the domestic front as well. So on an aggregate, you're looking at revenue targets being not too far off what has been estimated by the government in their projections for 2017. There might be a slight discrepancy, but I would expect them to be reasonably within line of sight. Moving on to the expenditure side. So here again, you're seeing recurrent expenditure has been projected to grow at around 10%, and that's a fairly reasonable level considering general increases in nominal GDP during the time frame. With regard to salaries and wages, it's a fairly nominal growth that is being projected. Some growth in terms of some of the transfers and subsidies, but there could also be expected to be some kind of savings in terms of better administrative measures in terms of procurement and so on as well. So whilst recurrent expenditure is projected to grow at 10%, overall expenditure is projected to grow at 17%. And the big increase is, as usual, coming from the projected growth in capital expenditure. Now, there's a 42% capex growth that is being budgeted, but this again, I think, is unlikely to materialize. If you look back at Sri Lanka's history, what has consistently happened is that we would tend to overestimate on the revenue side, and then try to catch up in terms of to meet the budget deficit target by cutting back on our capex. So here again, I think that is likely to be what would happen. Even though we may not miss too big on the revenue side, we're likely to not see this 42% materialization in capex growth in 2017. And that again, I think is not an ideal way to go about budgeting. I think it makes much more sense to have a more pragmatic target on capex and focus it on the areas that really would matter. So areas like education, transportation infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure, health and other key social infrastructure services. Have a focused capex plan for those, but without having this kind of large estimate and then being forced to cut back on without being able to plan that in a proper way. So this has really been the practice historically as well, and I'd expect probably a similar movement in 2017 also. So looking a little quickly at the borrowing strategy that the government is projecting for 2017. There's a projection of shifting a little bit out from foreign commercial borrowing sources. So probably maybe less emphasis on SLDBs and sovereign bonds. And 2017 is likely to be again a fairly volatile year in terms of global capital markets, particularly for emerging and frontier economies. So countries like Sri Lanka that are looking to tap global markets to roll over debt or to finance their expenditure are likely to find it quite tricky because of the significant political developments and the political movements that we've seen in the global environment and the implications of that on capital markets. So we've already seen in the post-Trump and before that post-Brexit situation, there was capital that was going back and forth out of frontier and emerging economies. And I think 2017 we're likely to see similar movements as well. Also with the Federal Reserve decision that is coming up in the later on this month. And again, the projections for how rates are going to increase in the US going forward into 2017, that again will have important implications for the movement of capital markets next year. And that will have very important ramifications for the way in which a country like Sri Lanka can borrow and tap into global sources. So the government is looking at probably less reliance on global capital markets. But even on the domestic on the non-bank borrowings is less than what has been projected last year, but still quite significantly higher than what has been in the previous years, 2014, 2013, and so on. The one area where I think there might be some kind of misalignment or overestimation is that they're expecting a positive inflow into the foreign investments in rupee-denominated government securities. This might be a little bit tricky to in terms of realization. Because again, as I was saying, in terms of the current global environment is not in a particularly conducive situation to expect significant inflows into rupee. Foreign investments into local government bonds and government bills, and also some of the tax changes that we have seen in some of these instruments may also make the secondary market in some of these instruments less liquid, and that could also be a discouraging factor. So I would keep an eye out on that. And if we don't see significant foreign inflows into the rupee security market, we might have to see more government borrowing either on the domestic capital in the domestic capital market or from foreign sources as well. So I think that is something to keep a lookout for. The way that I would see 2017 and the early part of 2018 is a really good chance to consolidate our fiscal position further, because if you look at the 2017 and early 2018, there aren't a lot of significant external repayments that are coming up in those 2 years. The big payments start building up from 2019, 2020 onwards. So we need to use these 2 years to really consolidate our position on the fiscal side, and so to make sure that we are on a good wicket when it comes to when the big payments come up, and the markets will then have confidence in our fiscal position, and we'll be able to refinance at a reasonably affordable rate. So that should really be the priority for 2017 in terms of its borrowing strategy as well. So looking at the likely macroeconomic implications, as I was saying, the more pragmatic deficit target that we are seeing for 2017 is really likely to ease the government's borrowing requirements. If you look back at 2015, with the deficit going up to 7.4%, there was a big requirement for increases in government borrowings. That, of course, draws out capital from the market that is available for the private sector as well, drains liquidity, pushes up interest rates, and makes things quite tricky. With the deficit being expected to be reduced, we could anticipate that the government's borrowing requirement is likely to be somewhat less, and therefore the drains on liquidity are likely to be less as well. So this should enable interest rates to remain around present levels up to into the first half of 2017, and if all goes well, to enable rates to start easing off in the second part of the year. Now, another point to keep in mind is that with some of the tax changes that we've seen on the government security side, there has been an uptick in interest rates as well, which is not predicted by most people. That has moderated to some extent in the immediate post-budget scenario, and there's still a little bit of uncertainty as to the implementation of some of these areas, but that is another point to keep in mind in terms of the movement of interest rates going forward as well. So interest rates, as I said, likely to remain elevated into at least into the first half of 2017, and demand is also likely to be fairly subdued in 2017. Also, particularly with the tax increases that we have seen on the domestic economy, further enhanced by the fact that interest rates will be high as well. So generally demand is likely to be subdued. Economic activity will be quite low, I think, in 2017. It will be quite a tough year for business in the domestic front. Imports, as I said, also likely to be remain quite moderate and modest in 2017. So the current account should be quite stable also, and that would be supportive of Sri Lankan rupee value, at least from domestic forces. External forces are a very different story. There's a lot of volatility that I would expect in 2017, and I think that would be the driver of whatever depreciation we see in the rupee into 2017. With the tax increases, of course, there's also going to be a one-off hike on the inflation side, but that's not really a demand-driven inflation. It's more of an artificial jump in the index. So I don't see too much kind of central bank concern about that from a demand perspective. But still, I'd expect inflation to remain at mid to high single-digit levels, around 6 to 7% into 2017 as well. So then just a couple of points on the kind of broader policy orientation of the budget. If you look at the strategies of the government, they have been looking at things like driving export orientation. And there have been some measures in the budget that have been supportive of this. For instance, there's a significant reference to trade facilitation measures that is good in both in terms of imports and in terms of exports. phasing out of some of these ad hoc taxes such as cess. These are things that have been problematic in terms of trade for a long time, and it will be positive if it can be done. But again, from the revenue perspective, it might not be something that can be done immediately or in the short term. But it's good that this is at least being thought about. Exim Bank, that is something that was not implemented in 2016. Again, it's come up in the budget. References to FTAs with some of the key markets in emerging markets in Asia. I see that as a positive, particularly in terms of positioning Sri Lanka as a kind of trading and logistics hub for the Indian Ocean region. I think that is a useful kind of supportive mechanism. Easing of foreign investment in land. Again, I think that is a positive in terms of supportive of FDI and supportive of again a broader outward orientation of the economy. In terms of short-term challenges, the removal of SWAT is, I think, going to be something that will be problematic for some of the exporters, particularly in the context of it being still in the early stages of the implementation of RAMIS. Now, if once RAMIS was fully established and there was a proven system and an effective method of administration, at that point bringing in SWAT, I think probably would have been a more pragmatic approach. But this could cause some kind of cash flow situations for some of the exporters. In terms of education and skills, which I would see as the other kind of major long-term macro priority, the budget speech again refers to investments in curricular development, teacher training, and so on. But there is very few specifics in terms of how this is really going to be taken forward. The focus, though, continues to be on investment in physical infrastructure, more than on reforms of education per se. And I think really we should try to flip that on the head. We should try to focus on enhancing the reform process of particularly of curricula, particularly of teacher training and the way that we actually teach. Sri Lanka still has a very exam-centric education system, and we don't really create the kind of skills that are required by the modern economy. We don't generate skills such as creativity, problem solving, analytical skills, being able to think out of the box. Those are not the skills that we are really inculcating, and that is really what we should be doing. So I would have preferred to see the budget focusing more in terms of giving more clarity on direction in terms of how we're going to spend money on these reforms to kind of generate this kind of big changes that we need in education as well. In terms of higher education, there's reference to enabling greater private sector supply of higher education. I think that's a big positive, and I hope that we see implementation of that going forward. In terms of finance, one negative that I want to point out is that there was a lot of reference in the budget, which is the Finance Ministry Treasury policy area. There's a lot of enroachment, I would say, into the central bank's domain. And I think that is a negative because the central bank should be an independent body being able to determine policy on the monetary side without significant influence from the fiscal arm of the government. So the fact that there was a fair amount of enroachment from the finance ministry into the central bank, I think is not an ideal situation, and I hope that that does not continue going forward. In terms of some of the specifics, the capital requirement increases could help consolidate the banking sector. Timeframes, of course, are going to be important to ensure smooth implementation of this. Directed bank lending, I think, is not so desirable in terms of efficient allocation of resources and smooth functioning of markets. Positives, though, in relation to commitments to listing some of the state-owned enterprises, I think that would be good in terms of development of financial markets as well. I think there's a few more areas on the financial sector that we can discuss more in the panel discussion. In terms of digitalization and ICT, just my penultimate point, again here, important to have this move towards greater digitalization of the economy. This was mentioned in the last budget as well. That continuity is there. For example, things like digital ID can really help in terms of things like targeting of subsidies. Again, important tying in with expenditure rationalization and so on. But of course, it's important to address issues like privacy and so on. National payment platform, again, useful in terms of creating the kind of modern economy where payments are done on a cashless basis, done through mobile phones and through other forms. But again, here it's important to clarify, say, what the role of the central bank is and what the role of ICTA is in this kind of policy as well. So again, good direction, but important to kind of clarify the way that it's going to be regulated and the way it's going to be implemented. Again, one of the negatives was the continued heavy taxation of the telecom services, the increase in taxes on data, for instance, above what you're seeing in some of the other areas, I think is again something that needs to be probably reconsidered. So as a summary, I would say the budget is largely good, and not as ugly as we have seen sometimes in the past. So commitment to fiscal consolidation is certainly a relief from a macroeconomic stability perspective. If we had another expansionary budget, it really would have been disastrous in terms of attempting to manage our debt situation, external debt in particular. Of course, with the increased taxation, you're going to see a relatively deflated economy in 2017. It's going to be a somewhat tough year for domestic business, I would think. But the way that I would see it is that this is kind of a needed short-term treatment to ensure longer-term stability and longer-term sustainability of the economy as well. So I would think the short-term pain is something that is necessary going forward. I would like to see further streamlining of government recurrent expenditure, driving efficiencies in things like procurement, driving efficiencies in human resources, and so on. There was reference in the budget to things like KPIs in the public service and in the state sector. That is again a good development, and hopefully those things will be implemented in a fairly full and comprehensive manner. I would also like to see I would have liked to see more prioritized spending on the reform of education, enhancing the service on the delivery of public services, and focus on efficient and smart regulation. I'm going to leave you with this slide. Just a very broad thought that we are in a situation where we are transiting from an economy where the state has always played a very large role in the economy. We've always had, until about 2006, very easy access to finance from our development partners. We used to always get money for 30 years, 10-year grace, 0 to 2% interest. Very easy to refinance our loans in that kind of situation. So during that time, we built up a very large state sector. Today, we have 1.3 million in the public service, 240 plus state-owned enterprises. The government dominates some of the key business sectors in the economy and so on. And the state basically uses up a lot of the scarce resources in the economy, which the private sector has to compete with as well. So I feel that the time has really come to shift away from this kind of large, economically significant role of the state to one that is more of an entity that sets the rules of the game, creates the institutions and strong institutions, has smart, unobtrusive regulation to address market failure, and at the same time also very effective intervention to address issues of social justice. As we have seen in this year in other economies in the US, in the UK, the failure to address social justice issues is also a crucial area in terms of the future of a liberal economic regime as well. So I think this reorientation of the state is going to be important, and I think what we're seeing in terms of fiscal consolidation is hopefully one of the first steps towards this end. Okay, let me end there, and thank you very much for your patient hearing, and I look forward to your questions in the panel discussion. Thank you.
LBR LBO Debrief. Sponsors.
Our identity is now a global force, and we will carry their legacy forward.
Come to Sampat Bank with your trust in us for all your financial needs. Sampat Bank, a haven for all your financial requirements. eFutures, we don't just build a mobile app, we build a business. Knowledge Partner. Endorsed by Research Partner. LBR LBO Debrief.
Thank you so much, Deshal, that you have this amazing capability to, summarize these, complex things, sometimes nonsensical as well, in a manner that layman like me can understand. Thank you so much. I think it's time, before we welcome our panelists, time for the second or third temperature check. Now, Deshal said it is good, not so ugly. So what is your take? Is 2017 budget good, bad, or ugly? So take your, mobile phones, log into www.lbo.lk/ask and tell us what you think. You agree with him or do not agree with him. He was very diplomatic. He said it's good, not too ugly. Okay, but here you don't have that choice. Is it good, bad, or ugly? Okay, voting starts now. Okay. Starts now. Somebody showed a beautiful cartoon earlier. Yeah. Can we see results? Oh. Whoa. I'm sure Finance Minister will be thrilled to see this. Not so, really. Oh, bad is catching up. Ugly? Yeah, people don't agree with you, Deshal, Oh, good is moving up. Maybe somebody from Treasury is here. Certainly not from the central bank. Oh, good. Wow. So 42% good, 32% bad, 25% ugly. So if you add bad and ugly, well, it's 57%. Our finance minister is going to be very happy about it. Anyway, thank you so much. So it is my pleasure to welcome our panel who will discuss the impact of budget, particularly in respect to the future of Sri Lankan business. So we have Deshal, then we have Shiran Fernando from Frontier Research, and Dr. Eteri Quentradze. I got your name right this time. Okay. And Arjuna Herath from EY, and then Shashi Kannambi from Sampath Bank. So today's moderator is Subhashini from Verite Research. So we have a researcher, we have three people from the industry representing 3 areas, and we also have someone who represented who bail us out. But they don't use the term bailouts. They have some funny names, program and various things. So can you remember that cycle, LKR cycle, Amal showed? So there's IMF was prominently, mentioned. And other thing is, if you look at the Sri Lankan newspaper cartoons, all the IMF, caricatures representing IMF, the fat white man wearing dark glasses and carrying a big bag of cash. See, you have a very intelligent, smart, and very charming woman as IMF representative. Okay, without further ado, okay, let me welcome. Please welcome our panelists. And Suhashini, over to you.
Thank you, Lakshman. So overall, although the polls indicated that bad and ugly percentage is higher than the good, overall I heard from morning till now a rather optimistic view about the budget. So, but during Deshal's presentation also I heard quite often the term relatively. So I get this feeling that we've gone through 2 disastrous budgets and now we are with a sigh of relief saying not so bad, instead of actually saying it is really good. So this is something I would also like to ask from the panel also. Are we really saying this is on its own a very good budget, or relative to the previous budgets this is better? So I would like to start with Eteri, because there was so much focus on IMF and the role IMF is making in actually getting the government to get their act together in terms of fiscal consolidation, and also how the IMF interventions work towards creating more confidence about the government's fiscal policy. So I would really like to know from your perspective, what does this budget reflect? Does this budget actually show that the government is in the right track and they are taking measures to address fiscal issues seriously, not just for this year? So a problem that Amal highlighted is we manage this year, we manage the next year, but we never get onto a sustainable path. So do you feel this is a budget that will help us manage this year and manage the deficit for this year, or are we on a sustainable path? What is your view?
Thank you very much. I guess IMF has been put on spot by organizers as well as this panel. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I think it was very comprehensive and it set a very relevant context for this discussion. Actually, I had prepared some points for setting out the context for budget discussion, but Dishal has done a very comprehensive job outlining those. I was thinking at some point, is he reading out from my notes? But he was obviously not, and we have not consulted each other either. So I think one important aspect to mention here is that definitely fiscal consolidation and revenue-based fiscal consolidation is a central reform issue in Sri Lanka. Revenue has been one of the major structural deficiencies in this economy. And in this panel last year and in our public messaging over a decade, I think now, we have been talking about revenues as a central structural weakness in this economy. So revenue-based fiscal consolidation being a central issue, obviously each budget is kind of assessed with this angle. Everything in this world is relative, so I don't think setting out this comparison in relative or in absolute terms will make a lot of difference. I think this budget is going into the right direction because it sets out a primary deficit target of 4.6%, which is going into direction of reaching 3.5% fiscal deficit by 2020, which was the major kind of macroeconomic parameter set out by Prime Minister last year. So definitely implementation of 2016 budget and expected outcome of the deficit for 2016, as well as commitment in 2017 are going into right direction. Secondly, we have been talking a lot about tax incentives, and Deshal also made a lot of accent about it. And Sri Lanka has this characteristic of being a low revenue country. Actually, tax revenues in Sri Lanka are one of the lowest in the world. And at the same time, when you look on Sri Lanka's tax system, you have a complex and high number of taxes, which are charged at relatively high rates. So how is it possible that high number of taxes, which are charged at such high rates, generate such low revenue? An explanation of that are actually tax expenditure. So tax expenditure is like aggregate term for rate reductions, tax holidays, tax exemptions. And Sri Lanka has excessive number of tax expenditures of holidays, which put a big drain on its tax revenue generation capacity. Now, why we think and why everybody talks about tax revenue being a central issue? Because it means that you are able to generate your public resources on your own without adding to your debt burden. And you need those public resources to be able to spend on health, education, social development, infrastructure without adding to your debt. Being able to address this significant issue, I think you are addressing issue for a decade, not 5 years, 10 years, 20 years to come for generations. So I think budget makes some important moves into this direction. Especially I want to kind of bring this audience's attention to one important transparency disclosure in this budget. If you look on annexes, they have published statement of tax expenditures. It's first time in history of Sri Lanka that such statement is being published. And it transparently discloses what are the costs of actual tax incentives. Why it's important? Because it opens for a public debate discussion what are the costs and benefits of tax incentives? How much actually this public is paying for certain incentive decisions, and whether those incentives are generating benefits which are expected by the public. We hope that this statement will continue with every budget, and also it will become and play a more prominent role in the public debate in Sri Lanka. We feel that it's extremely important move. Second, not to monopolize this discussion, I'll just mention one other point and I'll pass to other panelists, is announcement of new Inland Revenue Act. I think this has a potential to become Sri Lanka's landmark legislation, because it will lay the foundation for new balance between indirect and direct taxes. Current legislation is extremely deficient because of high number of incentives, exemptions. Actually, you are losing around 1 percentage point of GDP from your corporate tax because of these incentives, which is like 2/3 of what you are actually collecting. In that regard, I think it's extremely important that consultation processes around this Inland Revenue Act start early on, and there is a good consensus building and public understanding what are the benefits of this legislation. So I'll stop here, and thank you.
Thank you, Etteri. I would like to next put this question to Shiran. So Etteri was saying how the government shows right direction because the government is actually forecasting to bring down deficits. But again, this is also not new because previous governments also, even under the previous standby arrangement with the IMF, if I remember, we actually had a trajectory of reducing deficits. So from 2009 to, I think, 2014, we actually managed to bring down the deficit from 9% to something slightly above 5%, and then we busted it in 2015 to 7.4%, and then went back to IMF again, and now we are saying we are going back to 4.5%. I want to ask Shiran, from your understanding and your research, what is the difference? Is there a significant difference in the way the current government is approaching fiscal consolidation that makes you feel more confident that this elusive target of below 5% deficit is achievable within this period, under this government, which was not possible under the previous government?
Before I start answering the question, I'd like to thank Lakshman and the team for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Just to get direct into your question, I think even in 2015, if you look at how the budget deficit of 5.4%, if I'm not mistaken, was achieved, was through the cutting down of public investment. In the 2015 budget, in the 2016 budget, when it was announced in November, the public investment figure was 7% of GDP. The actual figure is 4.1%. That reduction in itself shows you how the deficit in 2016 has been reached. So that's the answer to your first question. But the strategy this time is very much different, I would say. I don't know whether it's a thought-out strategy, but what you're sort of seeing is a very top-down approach to the economy and towards the taxes. What sectors in the economy are growing, let's go and tax them, or let's increase the taxes on them. Because they are making the money, they are growing, let's get into their pile. And even if you look at some of the other contentious tax revenue proposals that are there, it's with the intention, okay, these are growing, these is where the pot of money is, which we can get, and let's go after that without, looking at proposals to widen the tax net and trying to get more SMEs and all that into play. So this year, compared to previous years, the revenue proposals are more viable. And in terms of the fiscal consolidation, I think in terms of the expenditure, what the government should probably get credit on is they've been a bit more responsible. So you've not seen handouts sort of given or subsidies increased in the expenditure side of things in the lead up to a local government election. Whether the local government election is really important or not is a different matter. But in the lead up to this, you've not seen, they might have had the incentive to do that, but they haven't. Although you've had little price reductions here and there, not really. So in short, I would say they are heading towards the corrective direction in terms of approaching fiscal consolidation.
I would like to turn to Arjuna, especially on 2 points. One is basically, Beshal and also Etteri both emphasized that using incentives, especially you are talking a lot to investors and you work along with the private sector. This is relatively a controversial issue when it comes to incentives and investment. And I would like to also find out, do you also believe that taxes are purely for revenue collection? And is there a role for taxes to make in terms of incentivizing investments or private sector growth? And secondly, it's what about the opposite? Can taxes actually disincentivize private sector growth and investment? And when you look at the probability of taxes being discouraging or disincentivizing growth, do you see any problems with this current budget? And overall, do you think this current budget is sending the right signal to the private sector and the investors?
Sure. A tax rate, a competitive tax regime, I think is important for investments, and no doubt about that. But it should not be a strong catalyst to drive investments, but a competitive tax regime is critical. From that perspective, and also in the perspective of attracting investments to the economy, local as well as FDIs, I think one of the things in relation to another question was that I think the budget is relatively good, as you were saying, is because there's a sigh of relief that is going to address the macroeconomic fundamentals that we were lacking. And it seems it's realistic. So that's a sigh of relief, and that is conducive for investments, but only thing is whether it's going to be sustainable. And for investments, you need a sustainable macroeconomic fundamental environment. What is lacking in the budget, as I see, is the policy direction. Policy direction of the government in terms of attracting investments and sustaining investments, coming into the country. From a scenario of improving doing the structural reforms that this economy requires, to managing the state-owned enterprises, impinging upon the markets is something that has to get addressed, and that is lacking. So the policy frame, it gives the sense that the budget has been focused on managing the budget deficit, generating the revenue, cutting on expenditure, and managing the budget deficit. Unfortunately, there is no clarity on the direction of what the economy should move. Now, that has to come very quickly if you are to actually get investments going, because investors want a stable economic environment with a policy direction. Now, another thing that I would like to emphasize is that also the budget has to facilitate a monetary policy, a conducive monetary policy environment. We all know that balance of payments is under stress, and the only way the balance of payment can get eased off is through very few instruments that we have. One is the remittances, other is the exports, and the FDI. And we heard in the morning that the remittances will plateau, and that will remain. What are we doing for exports? Is the budget actually, has the budget been a catalyst for driving exports? Well, I'm not quite sure. Has the budget been a catalyst for FDI? I'm not quite sure. So this is the environment that we have, but it's a sigh of relief. The macroeconomic fundamentals are in place. So possibly maybe another question to ask about, what do we really need to do for exports? What do we really need to do for FDI? But just to answer you very briefly, the question that you asked. Yep.
Thank you very much, Arjun. Taking from there, especially going back to Deshal, about the exports. Arjun was talking about exports and whether this budget actually catalyzes its intention to promote exports, because that is kind of one of the key priorities from run up to the election and after election to this date. Of course, it is in a challenging global environment. You're trying to promote exports, but at the same time, what you put down on your slide, to me, they looked a lot like very goodwill policy statements. They were not really fiscal, they didn't have any budget allocation, they didn't have any implementation days, and we know trade facilitation has been sort of something everybody pays lip service to for years, but which has not materialized. So other than removal of SVAT or increase on taxes on export sector, which were the more fiscal proposals that are actually can be implemented kind of thing. Everything else was just goodwill statements. So what do you think, like, is there anything government should have said about export promotion in budget, or should it be taken outside the budget, and what is your take?
No, I agree that there is nothing kind of concrete in terms of something that would specifically be promoting or supportive of exports in a very concrete manner. But I don't know. For me, if you look at the constraints to Sri Lankan exports, the fact that we have a labor market that is quite constrained, we have limited access to skills, we have relatively high costs, particularly when compared to productivity of labor, so we struggle to compete with countries like Bangladesh on price, and we can't compete with guys like Thailand and Malaysia in terms of competitiveness and technology. Those things you can't fix overnight through a budget, right? I mean, for that, I would say the best way to leapfrog those challenges is through export-oriented FDI, where you attract guys who want to set up here, use Sri Lanka as a base to export into markets in the rest of Asia, into the Indian subcontinent, and so on. They can bring with them the technology, they can bring with them the access to these markets, to distribution networks, and so on. And that way we can really accelerate and leapfrog to some extent. And using also our locational advantage, the fact that we have excellent logistical capabilities and in terms of access to both the east and the west coast of the Indian subcontinent, access to other Indian Ocean countries, and so on. One positive I would say is the statements towards moving into FTAs with some of the key emerging partners. That helps us in terms of creating market access. Other than that, I don't think those are issues that you can fix through a single budget. That needs to be a more concerted policy towards targeting potential export-oriented FDI, understanding what their requirements are, proactively going to them and setting up and creating, making a case as to why they should come here and set up. And then doing whatever you can to encourage that. And yeah, I don't think those are kind of things that you can do in the budget. I think it's in a separate forum. But I'd agree with Arjuna in that it's important that you get a kind of broad overall policy sense that gives you that direction also. I think the PM statement in some ways trying to provide that at a different forum. I'm not too sure how that kind of ties in with all this. But yeah, I think that's what I would say for that.
I would like to turn to Shashi. There are also questions coming up on the banking sector, this impact on spreads and all. So there has been a lot of proposals on the financial sector and affecting the banking sector. So can you explain your take from a banking and a financial market perspective? How does this budget reflect on the sector and what would be the impact?
Just to add what Deshal said, there was the proposal about this bringing in an Exim Bank in the budget proposal. I believe that is again directed towards encouraging exports from Sri Lanka. But the fact is we really do not know the size of the investment is going to be. But if you look at, I think that's encouraging for exports. But if you look at today, China Exim Bank has invested a couple of billions in Sri Lanka. That encourages Chinese contractors to come and do business in Sri Lanka. But then again, for Sri Lankan exports, how it's going to, because we as banks also in this space, I mean, we finance our exporters and we encourage exporters to go global. If this Exim Bank can bring in value additions much more than that the banks can provide, I believe that's in the right direction. Coming back to your question, the budget, it came in for finance, particularly the banking sector. There were a lot of negative sentiments. We all know the taxes that the proposed taxes are not so encouraging to banks because specifically this financial transaction levy, it's going to adversely affect our profitability. But overall, the fiscal consolidation and predictable environment gives a better opportunity for banks to grow. That's a positive factor. Then also there was this PPPs and SOEs will also provide bigger opportunities for banks to grow. Another positive thing is they were talking about instead of subsidies, the tax incentives. if banks can participate in those programs, provided the modality and everything is clear, there is going to be opportunities for banks. Those are the positive factors.
Negative factors?
The challenges, I would say.
Yes, let's call it challenges.
The challenges are actually the tax imposed. A lot of things have been told about this proposal on abolition of notional tax, which is going to affect investment in government securities. Banks are compelled to invest in government securities. 20% of our liability base has to go in there, whereas it is subject to only the corporate tax. Whereas now it's going to be double taxed. That is withholding, plus that is going to be 30-odd%. So banks' bottom line effect is something, it's going to be drastic on us, but we need to work out a way to absorb that. And what will happen is banks need more capital, and we are moving towards Basel III. How is this capital going to be raised? Usually, profit retention is a mechanism that all the banks use, because distribution is just a fragment of our year-on-year profits. So with the Basel III movement, we need more capital, and if profits are going to be less, then it's a question. Then the debt market. We raised Tier 2 capital, but this abolition of tax benefits that was given to debenture market is also going to create an issue when we go to raise Tier 2 capital. Tier 1 market equity capital also, we didn't see any encouraging proposals. So there are lots of things to think about because we are in a transition period moving for the compliance of Basel III. So negatives, positives, all in all, we understand that the government budget is looked at bringing in more revenue. It is a need of the hour and a country's requirement. Thank you.
The next question I would like to focus on actually the implementation, because at the end of the day, all the targets depend on the ability of the government to implement the proposals. And in 2016, we saw quite a disaster. Even the ability of the government to pass the VAT at 15% and removing the exemption created a huge backlash, and it took months to resolve. And as a result, that was one of the factors maybe that affected the revenue projections, which led to cutting down of capital expenditure to meet the deficits. So at the end, all your targets, all your aspirations depend a lot on is the political context and the current environment. Is good, conducive to actually implement these proposals. And I would like to ask Eteri, from your perspective, what is your take? Do you feel confident that the government would be able to actually implement these proposals? And what are the challenges that you see, and what advice would you have to make them, especially this consultation process? Do you feel that there can be improvements in consultation and actually explaining to the public better the need and sending the right signals? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Obviously, implementation is a key because here and in the past, in many governments, actually, people are used to comparing promises to promises. And it would be good for general public understanding to start comparing promises to actual outcomes. In this case, implementation, track record, as well as constraints to implementation will become more and more obvious. IMF being an institution focused on outcomes, our main job is actually to understand how policy commitments translate into implementation, and we are very much focused on those. I think one important detail that budget brings is this parliamentary oversight on budget implementation, where actually Ministry of Finance has to submit quarterly reports to the Parliament on how implementation of budget commitments as well as framework quantitative side is going on. I think it's extremely important feature from transparency point of view, as well as putting certain mechanism in place where you are comparing promises to implementation and actual outcomes. Sometimes we had a feeling during IMF review missions that we are only people who are looking on target implementation, being concerned why certain targets are not aligned with promises. I think having this parliamentary mechanism is extremely important for Sri Lanka going forward, because it puts some things that will work for the public not only this year, but many years to come, and could shape public debate into that direction. Deshal said, and we also think that revenue estimates in the budget are on optimistic side, and we have to be able to see implementation details of those proposals to be able to assess actually what's going to be a revenue impact. This is coalition government, so obviously any big legislative change requires a lot of consensus building, and I think it's for politicians to plan ahead and allow longer times for consultation to be able to bring supportive decisions around key legislation. So, it's in many respects, learning by doing, and it's also a process. So we hope that consultation processes around key legislations, for example, for Inland Revenue Act, could start early on, because it's a landmark legislation which require a lot of public buy-in and understanding what are the benefits of this legislation for general public. It's also type of legislations that require support from both sides of coalition, but getting it right means that you are getting something right for decades to come. You are laying foundation for some things that kind of cross passes party interests, but it is good for a general public.
Also, Sharan, I've actually, listening to Amal, the previous session, he made me feel like this discussion is totally useless, because he rejected the budget altogether, saying it's almost just a wish list, right? So which gives, again, the idea of implementation and the credibility. What Arjuna said, that actually budgets are looked up to as not only a short-term policy statement, but also giving direction to medium-term policy direction as well. But over the years, the budgets seem to have increasingly lost credibility as a document that sets policy direction. And is it a wish? Is this budget also another wish list? And where do you do? Now everybody says this is better than the before. So where do you think, in terms of actually going forward in building credibility and confidence? Has this budget been indifferent? Do you expect it to be any different?
I think if you look at what was, say, budgeted for 2016, you had this huge revenue growth figure that Deshal was mentioning, and you didn't have things like VAT and a lot of the revenue legislations coming in. Yet revenue has grown 20% in the first 9 months. So it really doesn't, yes, the budget, that one single day of the year is very important to tell you how your taxes are going to be calculated. But it's also about collecting the taxes, having, stringent policies. They are improving that as well, which a lot of people discount out. So for example, in this budget, the revenue on absolute terms is supposed to go up by 390 billion. 140 billion is all the revenue proposals we are discussing, like the notional tax, the financial transaction levy, everything. 100 billion maybe could be from the VAT and NBT and other collection. But 150 billion, the remaining bit of it, is through these revenue measures, is through widening the tax net, through RAMIS, things like that. So I think while the focus is on these proposals and the implementation of it, we're sort of missing the focus that the landscape in tax collection, is changing. Even if you look at, to the credit of the finance ministry, in terms of how they are projecting pay your taxes. These are your taxes at work. Projecting that on media, in terms of radio, television, trying to bring that awareness that, okay, this is why exactly you need to pay your taxes. So I think it's an overall change that's happening, and I think it's a change that you need to see the budget more than a day where you know your taxes, you know what's going to happen in terms of subsidies and all that, to a process where it'll be a long-term framework and a long-term framework for taxes and things like that. So it's a transitionary period, I would say.
Going back to Arjuna, I think I just wanted to ask also, now in terms of paying taxes or tax compliance, Sri Lanka's ranking in the world, even in the Doing Business Index, is very low. We seem to have a more complicated tax system, and the cost of paying taxes seem to be very high, so we are ranked very low. So in terms of, is it a budget that is basically, we have this system of introducing ad hoc taxes just to raise the revenue for that year. So we had the super gains tax, and then we had this import cycle, which brought last year a lot of revenue in terms of excise on motor vehicles, but none of these are sustainable, right? So this year also we have a set of taxes. So we keep on introducing different types of taxes and experimenting every year. What do you think this reflects in terms of for the investors? And secondly, are we moving towards simplifying taxes and streamlining tax administration in a manner that will help us actually move up our ranking and give the feeling to the investors that taxation is not overly a burden on the private sector?
Sure. So if you really see in terms of ranking of corporate tax in the world, Sri Lanka is in the midpoint. Corporate tax is in the range of up to 40%. We're at 28%. Income tax of individuals, we are slightly in the lower segment. That also goes up to about 40%. We are at 24% now. Now what has happened is we have been having ups and downs on income tax and corporate tax. We went down to 12-16% on income tax, now we're going up to 24%. I'm quite sure sometime down the road we'll bring it back down to 16%. Corporate tax, same. So I don't think anyone will sort of grumble if we have a direction on this and maintain the level of tax that we should maintain. We also have a scenario of VAT. We are bringing in so many amendments to the VAT. It's no more VAT we have. We have input, no input tax, we have output tax, so on. The value addition concept is completely distorted now. So we have a big issue in terms of our tax policy direction, and we must get to rationalize in this. Even in this budget, we don't know, we have certain taxes being increased now. Is this the trend? Will we maintain it? Or is the government's intention to bring these taxes down subsequently? That's the disaster. I don't think corporates or individuals will not mind if you have a consistent tax policy. And if the economy is growing, incomes will increase and you will pay the taxes. And even for investments, this is a huge issue. Because you don't know what the VAT, still a lot of people don't know what amount of VAT they will have to pay actually. And a lot of industries are struggling with these rules and proposals that came to understand what the impact is and to understand what we have to pay. So I think my answer to your question is very critical and very important. First of all, to have a consistent policy and direction on tax, income tax, corporate tax to value-added tax, and simplify those taxes to these three elements plus maybe a few more. And we must get to this as quickly as possible, and I don't think we have seen a direction of that in this budget, and hopefully very soon we'll see a direction on that.
I would like to turn to Deshal again on the World Bank and IMF both have stated the importance of reducing para-tariffs, right? So actually tariffs and para-tariffs together, just the taxes on international trade alone brings 20% of tax revenue. And this is at a time where you're really having a very low tax to GDP ratio of about 13%. What is how feasible, although we know the cost of para-tariffs and high high levels of protectionism on overall efficiency of the economy. But at the same time, the taxes at the border are the easiest to collect. Especially when your revenue administration is very weak, when your collection is very weak, you're always depending on, and also it is one of the taxes that is easier to collect, right? So what is your take on actually the probability of Sri Lanka removing government? These three budgets, despite these 100 products, as far as I know, is still not announced, right? So for now, 3 budgets, but despite everybody saying para-tariffs has to go, it does not seem to be that the government has the courage, either politically or on revenue terms, to let go of it. So what do you feel that the government should do, and how can we address the para-tariff issue? And if we remove these para-tariffs, will these announced reforms to the tax or introducing of new taxes will be able to recover the revenue lost from reduced para-tariffs?
Yeah, so I think we rely on things like para-tariffs mainly because of the failures that we've had in terms, and the leakages that we've had on the other taxes. So things like corporate taxes, the 1% of GDP.
Maybe just good to explain, I know the term para-tariffs is known to everybody here. Just to say that para-tariffs are any other tax other than import duty that is only imposed on imports, like the port and airport levy and import cess.
Yeah, so the reason why we've had to have these is because of the failures and the kind of leakages out of our other taxes. And I agree that in the short term, it won't be easy to remove them without having a significant revenue implication. So I think the way that I would look at it is that we need to focus more on improving the alternative taxes. So improving the collection of corporate and personal income taxes, basically that shift to that direct taxes. I think that is where the answer lies, where they're relying less on indirect taxes, more on direct taxes. And that way also we are able to kind of do these trade reforms without compromising our revenue situation. Like one of the big factors that makes it very difficult to go into trade reform by reducing taxes, creating more competition in the domestic economy is the fact that as soon as you reduce your border taxes, your revenue gets hit. So it's a bind. I mean, the government really doesn't have huge options in terms of doing that in the short term. There is no kind of, okay, you can't really say, look, I'll remove this cess but then increase something else, because there are not a lot of options there. You can't also, on a general basis, increase your customs duties because we are bound by our WTO commitments and other bilateral and regional commitments as well. So in that context, I would only look at it from a long-term perspective that, we have to move out of these para-tariffs, and you do that by improving your administration, you improve your collection of your more traditional personal corporate income taxes and your other domestic taxes as an alternative.
To add to that question, Deshal, do you feel that it will have an impact on trade deficit? Because what we're talking about right now is like protection levels of 50 to 60%. When you add the import duty to cess to port and airport levy, the protection levels can go up to 50%, 60%, some cases 70% even. And we are talking about unit taxes as well, right? So the other thing is, are we actually by force curtailing import demand? And when the taxes come down, can it actually lead to an increase in demand, then which will not have a huge impact on revenue because you're collecting more, because you're importing more, but then it can have a repercussion on your trade deficit. You're struggling with your export revenue, and at a time it could. So what is your view on that?
I think from a practical perspective, you're not going to have kind of a reduction from a 70% effective tax to a 20% effective tax. It'll be a much more marginal change, and over time it'll be something that happens. So I'm sure the government will manage it in a way that is not going to be adversely impacting your trade deficit. Though of course in the longer term, I see what your point is, but in terms of management of it, it'll be a much more kind of incremental procedure.
Okay, just to turn back to, so basically I think that if please feel free to answer any of the questions you feel you want to pick. There are some that are very entertaining as well, but I don't know whether I want to take them up. But there is one question that I really want to look at, but I will go to Shashi first before that. One is about this government wanting to put directions on the banks to lend to this sector, saying agriculture, SMEs, women, exports. How are these just political statements in the budget to look good, or how practical are they to tell the government? Because if you add all of that, it's about 50% of your expenditure is decided by the government saying these are the sectors you can lend. It looks good for the government if the citizens actually believe this is going to be happening, but what is your take on this?
Yeah, Subhashini, it's about 50%. But if you look at some other sectors, SME, anyway, the competition is such that, and also the returns are such that today all the banks are moving into SME sector. And SME sector and agriculture, even currently there is a 10% threshold. And the banks are supposed to carry 10%, minimum of 10% of their entire portfolio. And those have been, we have been following it. But some of the sectors that they have mentioned this year, such as youth, women entrepreneurship, and I believe in time to come, because as an industry, tourism is also growing, probably we'll have space, all the banks to carry 5% portfolio. But the two sectors that I mentioned, youth and women entrepreneurs, whether there is a market, that's a question. And there is still a gray area as to when this has to be compiled. So good direction, but there's no specific dates given, or it looks like it's a request merely. But these are sectors that anyway banks also looking at growing their portfolios, but not to the extent that the proposal says.
I think it's quite simple. You just need to find a young female smallhold export agriculture person and you're covered, right?
And the question is, we don't know whether it's mutually exclusive. I mean, if you look at it.
There were several questions about, because we are talking a lot about revenue. This budget has created a lot of discussion about revenue, and a lot of people say that presence of IMF and the need to augment revenue has received a lot of attention on revenue, and also there are mechanisms in place to some extent to ensure that there is some accountability in the terms of revenue. For example, even the fiscal management reports, I think, focus a lot about government having to report how much do they actually reach the targeted revenue, where the fallbacks and all that. But when it comes to public confidence and credibility, it's a lot about what do they do with this money. say the expenditure side. And as far as I know, maybe Atari can correct me, there is little emphasis that IMF makes on expenditure targets or the accountability in terms of implementing expenditure proposals in that way, or whether the budget deficit is made by cutting the capital expenditure or augmenting revenue, and what is the cost of continuously cutting capex to meet but deficit target. So these are questions that have been raised a lot, but firstly I would like to know whether the IMF actually focus on expenditure, because even the willingness to pay the taxes right now, the reluctance to pay the taxes comes largely because people feel government is not accountable in terms of expenditure. And none of us know to what extent the expenditure proposals were implemented. Although we get a statement about the revenue collected, we don't get a statement about the expenditure. How much was spent and for what, and why, if certain sector the allocation was not given, why, what the reasons are. So do you feel this is important, and how much emphasis does IMF put on this?
Of course, expenditures are extremely important. And as Teshal also discussed, and also you set a context for this comment, past episodes of fiscal consolidation in Sri Lanka were mainly based on expenditure compression, because you had ambitious revenue targets which always fell short of the target, and then expenditures have been curtailed, and many of the capital spending promises were actually unfunded promises for which actual financing has not been identified. So obviously cutting something which has not been funded in the first place is quite easy. But then what does this practice brings you to? Not being able to raise revenues consistently for a decade you're effectively eroding your capacity to spend on health, education, on social development. And actually, those spending lines need to be augmented, and there has to be public resources available for those spending lines to grow going forward, because spending on those are essential for Sri Lanka to continue its path of social development. Again, to be able to get there, first you need resources. That's why I think in our messaging, primary focus has been on revenues. In terms of expenditure efficiency, we provide a lot of technical assistance on public financial management, especially on commitment controls and cash management, as well as we make a lot of emphasis on bringing automated systems to manage public finances in an efficient and transparent way. In that sense, rolling out of ITMI system, which is automated system for public financial management, is extremely important, and that is one of the reform priorities which IMF is supporting prominently, as well as more technical issues like commitment controls, cash management, financial regulations. All those aspects focus on efficiency of spending, and efficiency of spending is very high on our agenda. On that side, we do a lot of hand-holding in terms of building capacity. And you don't hear a lot of technical recommendations or technical assistance report recommendations discussed publicly, because that's knowledge transfer from institution to institution. Our world-class technical experts come here and spend actually weeks and months working in the Ministries of Finance or Central Bank or Statistics Office, trying to understand constraints on the ground and help them to improve, to make those systems better. So long answer short, expenditures are extremely important. Again, coming back to the point of why do we hear revenue targets being met, but why don't we have clear understanding what was an actual spending against promises made in the budget? I think, again, parliamentary oversight mechanism with quarterly reports will be able to shed the light there. And I think role of the public debate and civil society in this is extremely important, because you will have information available to you to ask right questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Arjuna. Does our go on the same point, our corporates, when the budget is announced, looking mainly at tax proposals and how they will be taxed, to what level of emphasis do the corporates put on expenditure proposals? Because we know the general public puts a lot of attention on expenditure proposals. The salary hikes, the wages, the subsidies, the pension payments, all of these expenditure proposals the general public is very much interested in. What about the corporates, and also what about the accountability and transparency in terms of expenditure proposal implementation? What do you feel can be done to improve the transparency?
Yeah, from a corporate sector point of view, whilst they are looking at the revenue measures a lot, but they do look at the expenditure, because that sets the scene for infrastructure development too, and to be a catalyst in doing business. So to that extent, any specific proposal that impact a sector will be clearly looked at and will be welcome. But going back to just before answering you, the other question is about the implementation issue. As I see, having worked with a few government agencies, I must say a lot of the time the proposals for capital expenditure is put in a very ad hoc manner. Because the budget proposals are being called, you will quickly put together a proposal, and submit, and that will get approved. And there is no clear vision, there is no clear strategy of implementing it to whatnot. And that's one of the reasons that actually you fall short on the CapEx. Also, you have a scenario where sometimes two reasons why CapEx shortfall is one is the one that I said. The other one is, of course, you defer your cash payments and manage your budget deficit. So the accrual accounting concept doesn't exist, and you have the ability to actually manage your CapEx by not paying suppliers or even recurrent exchange for that matter, and managing budget deficits. So to that extent, you do have. So my take on this is that a focused strategy on a government agency basis, on a sector basis, is very critical for CapEx expenditure to be effective. And we need to hold those agencies accountable for those proposals. So when the proposals comes to the Ministry of Finance, I think there has to be some vetting process to ensure it's a meaningful project. It's a project that's is going to have a desired outcome and an impact, and so on and so forth. Now, that process doesn't happen, I believe, I don't know, I feel it doesn't happen effectively. So that's something that needs to get done. And I suppose the pushing of projects also happens based on the need of ministers to policymakers, and some have urge to push it, some doesn't have urge to push it. So it is on that basis that this CapEx expenditure happens. So overall, my take on this is that we allocate something like 600 billion, if I'm not mistaken, for an year on CapEx, and the outcome and impact of that has to be measured. And we need to have outcomes on that, the impacts of that, some kind of framework to assess this has to be in place, and pre-submission also that has to get done so that you can actually measure it post-budget spending.
So this discussion always makes me think of Amal, thinking we are, again, here also we are prescribing a wish list that is never going to be implemented. But unfortunately, there is very little that can be done, but I feel maybe do you feel the private sector has a greater role to play, or the civil society has a greater role to play, like Etteri said, to hold government accountable in general? Deshal, Shiran, do you feel that there is a lot of room for us, for civil society and the private sector to play this role, actually asking the government what happened to this proposal, why wasn't this implemented? Because they are the ones who know whether something was done or not, and why do you feel that that this is not happening in this country? And there is this open government partnership that is coming into play. Do you feel that will help, or is it just another exercise that will really not have any material impact?
Well, I think with the implementation of the R2, the Right to Information Act, I think we can better get those data now when it comes into force, I think from April onwards. But so that option is available, I think, for the public as well as researchers or private sector or anyone to actually go for it. But the overall issue, I think the framework is everyone is, so the budget's held, and after that we have like 2 to 3 weeks of roadshows of what the budget means, everyone trying to figure out what the minister said at this statement, what at this forum, at that forum, and it's a consultation process after the budget. But I think maybe LBO could maybe partner this, have a conclave with the business community and the private sector to figure out, okay, the Treasury, for example, says these are revenue proposals on day one. Then the private sector comes back and says, okay, so the consultation happens then. They meet it out, they fight it out, you know what exactly is feasible, what is not. So for example, even with the notional tax thing, it does bring in a lot of revenue, but it has an impact on the market because different market participants are right now taxed at different rates, the corporate tax rates. So with the removal of it, it sort of distorts it, according to my understanding. Maybe someone in Marketplace could probably correct me if I'm wrong. But that consultation pre-budget does not happen. And on the expenditure side, I think the government can have, for example, an open forum, use media, for example, to tell the public what exactly is happening with the expenditure.
Is the public demanding such a forum? Why should government come and display its weaknesses, shortcomings, and what it's not doing right if the public is not demanding? My question seriously is, why isn't the private sector or the public demanding the government? Like parliamentary oversight is one thing, that is one way of making sure, but do you feel there is a problem in that?
I think when you see on social media and some of the newspapers, when they carry like this amount of vehicles to be imported, or the ministers are looking at this forum, there is a lot of outcry and this thing. So I think that outcry should be consistent across expenditure proposals maybe, and then that consultation will happen. But I think the public does want to know where the taxes are being spent. I think there is no means to facilitate that right now with the public. That's what's missing.
Yeah, just one comment, and this is something that I have been discussing publicly as well. Do you think there is a need for annual consultations on tax policy decisions? Because this demand to have annual consultation means that you are going to change something every year. Do you want your tax system to keep changing every year? Because it seems kind of inbuilt mechanism here that you need to tweak your tax system in one way or another 1 year. Maybe more kind of feasible way to reframe it is that you give direction for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, you set your fundamentals, and then consultations are effectively whether you are going into right direction or not going into right direction. And I think reframing this discussion from annual consultations to more medium-term consultations will enable public to focus on bigger issues. What is my tax structure? Is it a fair tax structure? Is it simple enough? Is it administrable? And you can't have this discussion in annual consultation cycle because you can't fix this problem with a single budget. So that's why extending the time frame for this type of consultations is extremely important, because this need for annual consultations kind of reinforces this incentives versus tax changes equilibrium, which is not a good equilibrium to be in.
Actually, that I totally agree. The country really needs this sustainable tax system, that you actually know your taxes, know your rates, and your tax base is widened, simplified, that you don't have to actually have this continuous discussion about revenue proposals, which is problematic. But what I'm more keen on is, but there has to be consultations about how the government is spending that revenue. And also there has to be reporting about how the government actually spent that money, because that is what will, to me, I don't know, maybe I would like to know the panels, that will make the taxpayer willing to pay the taxes, saying, okay, the government is actually using this money for productive purposes, and they're investing in education, health, public transport, and that kind of confidence building in Sri Lanka, you feel that confidence is very, very low. And so just to understand, but at the same time, despite people complaining randomly here and there is no real mechanism to hold the government accountable and say, before you announce this year's budget, tell us what happened with the last year's expenditure.
Can I just add to that? I think one positive development is the new parliamentary committee, the Committee on Public Finance, which has been set up with exactly that objective, to create some sense of accountability, where they would look at the way that the revenue proposals and the expenditure proposals have been set out, test the assumptions, and then make some sense as to how realistic these are, and then hopefully going forward be able to hold the government accountable if it fails to meet some of these targets or fails to commit to what it had been proposed previously. if that system gets entrenched and institutionalized in an effective manner, then I think that will create the kind of incentive structures to generate some degree of good behavior in terms of good practices in terms of setting budgets in the future. So I think it's a good initiative, but I hope again that it kind of has strength and has teeth, so that it has the kind of visibility also like an institution like COPE or something along those lines, because I think that would also generate the public interest as well and focus attention on these key issues.
There were several questions about the banking sector. There were questions about lending, whether regulated lending creates a level playing field among state banks, foreign banks, and domestic banks, and also whether the current proposals will have an impact on the banking spreads. Do you have any comments? I'm also not an expert on banking, so I would like you to.
I don't think it's about creating a level playing field, because this directed lending, the intention I believe is to grow certain sectors. For a banking sector, whether it's private or a state bank, level field playing will come by way of if your cost of funds is going to be different to each other. Because sometimes we see that some of the refinance schemes, those are available only to certain banks, not to everybody. And that creates a difference in the field. Other than that, I don't think this particular budget proposal is aimed at that. That won't have an impact.
Thank you. So we have 15 minutes. I would really like the panel to answer any of the questions. If they feel there are questions you would like to take up. But please feel free to answer any one of those questions. But I just want to focus a little bit more on the transparency and the accountability of the budgeting process, even in terms of implementation. We talked about the expenditure implementation, but even at the stage of budget formulation, the exercise of calling for budget proposals, I've been with the chamber as well. I think Deshal has worked with the chambers in preparing these budget proposals. Is it a meaningful process, or is it just ticking a box to say, oh, we consulted, we got the proposals? But do you feel there is a meaningful process of actually getting proposals from the different stakeholders and in formulating the budget? Because overall, there is a sentiment that our budgets are rather weak policy instruments.
I think that the consultation process has improved over the years. I think there does seem to be the kind of messages that are coming out from the private sector and from, I think, certain industry lobbies as well. I think that comes out quite clearly. I think my concern is that sometimes certain industry lobbies are, sometimes disproportionately effective in terms of getting their message across. Whereas, for instance, consumers who are not organized in that similar way don't necessarily have that same kind of effective voice. So yeah, I would say it has improved, but I think really what is more relevant is what you're talking about in terms of accountability and ensuring that the government does stick to what has been said and both in terms of revenue and in expenditure. But yeah, I would think that in terms of getting the kind of requests are, but what you tend to get is wish lists, right? You don't really sometimes get the kind of long-term policy measures that would be driven, but you often get, one of the other things that has driven all of these incentives and these leakages is this same kind of thing, where people just ask for a tax incentive to be able to support a certain sector, and then the government would either listen to that or not. So I don't think there's proper structure and proper kind of long-term nature of these consultations. I think that would be the improvement that I would see, but in terms of the voice getting across, I think that has certainly taken place.
Shiran, you were, even during lunch, you were saying about the importance of monetary policy and fiscal policy coordination in Sri Lanka, and also in terms of macroeconomic stability, which is another big problem in Sri Lanka in terms of macroeconomic fundamentals, getting them right, which is very important for exports and investments as well, and also the coordination between the central bank and the treasury of the monetary policy and the fiscal policy. What is your take on the trajectory that is taking place right right now also going back to the statements that Deshal made in his presentation, whether the Ministry of Finance is going beyond their mandate in terms of certain financial sector regulations. I would like to know your view about that.
So I think it's somewhat of a new trend that maybe will develop in 2017 or could just die down, is this divergence or in terms of the trajectory of the finance ministry and the central bank. Because if you listen to the central bank, for example, they have been talking about, the fiscal is bad, the budgets have been bad, but now the budget is relatively okay, and things have been done on the banking sector and things like that, which sort of infringe their oversight, even in terms of lending restrictions and things like that. So you are getting this, environment where maybe there will be overlaps between the two. I'm not specifying out the two individuals, but in terms of the institutions as well. And in the past, the Treasury, and there was a question, I think, on that as well, the Ministry of Finance and the Treasury has generally maybe had a general overall say in the direction of the central bank rather than the central bank having an overall say over the Treasury. But with the new governor, I think, given his independent nature and given the history he's coming from, has the ability to sort of propel monetary policy up as well, so that it doesn't follow fiscal policy. And that will be a key trend, I think, which might emerge next year. It's not something you've not seen in the past. I think even in the previous regime, you saw clashes between the Treasury and the central bank as well. A case in example was, I think, the budget in 2011 had a 3% depreciation of the currency, which I think the central bank was maybe caught out of even. So it's not something we've not seen in the past, but it's an emerging trend, which overall, in terms of macro stability, could turn out to be a bit positive. But I mean, if they're still on the same page in terms of the growth story and things like that, I think it's great. But it's a growing trend that I think you need to sort of follow through.
Is there anything you want to, please, like I said, it's very difficult for me to pick. There are lots of different types of questions that come in. But Deshal, I would also like to know in terms of this discussion on exports, right? So this, especially the reforms that are required, the structural reforms. One problem that Arjuna also mentioned is, for a long time, the people were expecting a policy framework for the government, right? So last year, it was before November budget, the Prime Minister came and gave a very brief statement. But since then, there has been announcements made by him saying that there'll be a 5-year strategy, there'll be a more long-term strategy coming. But this year also, before the budget, it was just a similar statement, which really did not articulate the policy direction. And this lack of policy direction is a major problem. And then, like Arjuna said, the budget also, then you look up to the budget to say, will it give this policy direction from the short to medium term? So Arjuna's take was that he does not really see this policy direction coming out. So what is your take? Do you feel that the government is indicating, despite saying, okay, we want to increase exports, we want to increase FDI, but the trajectory shows that our FDI record this year is worse than last year. Last year it was worse than the year before, and the exports are no better. Exports are from 2015, 2016, 2017, the growth, actually we are having negative growth in exports. So despite all what they have been saying, we don't seem to see practical results. And is it one reason because of lack of a policy direction, lack of everybody falling in line with this one policy framework? And do you see this budget also has failed to give this policy direction? And is this a big problem?
I don't know. I mean, if you're looking at, we already discussed the kind of structural issues that affect exports, and I don't see a policy statement changing that, right? To address those structural issues, you need to go through those tough reforms. You need to address education. You need to address skill availability in a substantive manner. You need to address issues of your access to land, access to utilities and things that are at a reasonable cost. Again, these are all areas where we are not competitive in. So the policy direction, I would say, in a broad sense, has been provided. I think what you said about, export orientation, using our locational advantage, etc. And I don't see that as the real impediment. It's those issues of competitiveness that are the real impediment to exports. From a policy perspective, what an investor would want is to not have things being changed around all the time. You don't want this to have to set up an investment with the expectation of having a tax framework of X, and then the next year coming and having that reversed. I think that is what you don't want to see. I don't think it's a question of having like a 10-year plan, which is probably not going to materialize in that way as well. So I think it's a bit more kind of simple expectations. The expectations of don't change what you're doing all the time, no ad hoc changes. I think that is what is really required from an investor's perspective, more so than like a roadmap.
Yes, Arjuna.
I agree to some extent, but we would like to see the Prime Minister's statement coming well in advance, so that it's taken into account in formulating the budget. This year's Prime Minister's statement had saying he would like to see a digital economy. He would like to see commercialization of agriculture. He would like to see tourism as a thrust industry. Now, all these three industries, I think, has been impacted with tax. Digital economy, we saw Dishal saying the telecommunications sector is heavily taxed. Tourism, 14% goes up to 28%. Of course, there is a subsidy of up to 500 million government is going to subsidize on refurbishment, but we must leave that kind of thing to the industry, not to government to go and subsidize. There was a question to say, are these taxes killing the goose that lay in the golden eggs? So there are trust industries we must foster. We're talking about IT as a trust industry. Do we see anything in IT? A skills gap is immense in terms of construction industry trying today. Apparel industry has issues. So I think skills development was an aspect that was in the budget, but it was not, I think we may need to get to sector-specific skills requirements. Apparel, tourism. Tourism is another huge skills shortage that exists. I think we need to have those elements that gets embedded in the budget through a policy framework that comes well in advance. And if we can have this coherent policy framework, I think there could be a lot of confidence that gets into the system.
So what you're saying is it's not just inconsistency, but lack of alignment with what you're saying and what you're doing. This inconsistency between words and actions, and also translating some of the policy statements into implementation. The government seems to be struggling. Shiran, do you wanted to say?
Just to answer some of the questions that sort of addressed to me, and maybe some I could provide assistance on. So I think the general trend is that we've been talking about belt tightening, revenue. We're not going to have fun and good times, although Christmas is next month. And when is the country going to prosper? I think 2017 with this budget is probably be a recorrective year. And if we get that stability, a lot of external risk as outlined by Amal in his presentation, which we sort of need to navigate through, because all these budget estimates will go out of the window if, for example, trade takes a hit, and as Dishal mentioned, it could even be lower next year. So revenue then, once again, we're back to square one in terms of improving revenue and things like that. So those things need to be a thing. So it'll be pain in 2017, and hopefully gains in 2018, 19, and beyond. In terms of some of the one-off taxes, yes, I think some of the rate increases have brought about it in terms of that 20% growth rate, but collection in terms of giving these revenue collection centers targets and making sure that they meet them has also helped prop up revenue, I think. There was a comment on if I'm anti-Keynesian and something with fiscal stimulus. I don't think there is fiscal stimulus, a lot of that going around. So that's part of the statement is wrong. Anti-Keynesian, I don't have a particular view on that. I'm more of an up-down economist, if I was to say it that way. So if you've been following me, maybe you've not got it right now. But I think fiscal stimulus right now, given the juncture, would do more harm than good, even though it'll improve popularity and maybe spur growth. So it's maybe not timely, I would say. That's about it in terms of the questions.
There are some questions addressed to IMF. I liked this question, why IMF is so keen on Sri Lankan economy. So I think as perceived, keen means we're doing our job. So I think I'll take it as a compliment. But we try to be, we have 188 member countries. So we do engage with every member country in policy dialogue very closely, and we try to understand specific constraints in this country and try to be helpful the best we can. Another question was about extended fund facility, which is 1.5 billion program, which will be disbursing for 3 years. I think this program gives an excellent opportunity because it supports key reform priorities of the government. So in many respects, you could look at it as a support mechanism to be able to go and do what you wanted to do for a long time. And we'll be able to help those reforms, not only by financing, but most importantly, by providing extensive technical assistance on various policy directions that you want to implement. So I'll stop there. I see big stops.
Yes, I think our time is up. Thank you very much for all your contributions. And I will let Lakshman take over.
I think we had a wonderful panel discussion, very enlightening, very stimulating. Perhaps not all that optimistic, certain things, but that's a reality. I think people, almost 90% of the people here, audience, are from the industry, corporate executives. I believe that you took away certain messages, certain indications in the budget, in short term as well as long term. We all know that no budget is perfect budget. And there will be certain sectors in the industry who do not like, certain sectors who like. And I think there were very valid discussions on consultation that need to have pre-consultation in the budget proposal formulation stage. Of course, there was a warning from Deshal that will also lead to new industry in Sri Lanka lobbying, probably. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. And also the transparency and accountability, and whether IMF has some say over accountability and transparency. Otherwise, we borrow money, and government do not stick to the expenditure discipline required, and we go back to the same cash LKR circle. Amal presented. Thank you so much, Deshal. Wonderful to have you with us always. As I said, that you have this, capacity to make things very simple and concise. Perhaps, we should email your presentation to Finance Minister himself. Shrikant, thank you. Having you once again on our stage, bringing that, perspectives as an leading analyst. Eteri, thank you so much for your contribution. Well, I didn't really mean to put you on spot, but whether I like it or not, okay, all eyes are on IMF. Thank you so much joining us once again, and giving your honest opinion, which are extremely valuable to Sri Lankan economy as well as to the industry. Arjuna, thank you as one of the most senior partners of one of the oldest accounting companies in Sri Lanka. And also you interact with a large number of clients from many industries, so you have unmatched exposure and experience working with clients, so that we value the inputs coming from you. And Shashi, I think you are in a very challenging position, unfortunately, from the general public, depositors, borrowers, as well as now the regulators and the government. Thank you so much for joining us, Satin Subhashini. It is wonderful, and you very, very skillfully, navigated a very difficult topic. Unfortunately, I think there were very, very interesting questions. So, but unfortunately, we do not have time to entertain all those questions. If you would like to send those questions again specific to individual speakers, we can share their email with the permission from the panelist. We will put it up on our website so you can directly communicate. And thank you so much. And our next session is at 4 o'clock, final session. So we have a 25 minutes break. Please be back at seats by 3:59 and 59 seconds. And please put your hands together and thank our great panelists.